Welcome to another CHRO Conversation, hosted by the Center for Executive Succession at the Darla Moore School of Business. I'm your host, Anthony Nyberg, and today we are speaking with Nicole Lamoureux, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Human Resources Officer at IBM, meaning that she leads IBM's people strategy, skills, and employee experience and services and global HR team, supporting more than 250,000 IBMers across 170 countries. Nicole, it is always a great joy to have you here. Thank you for coming back.
Oh, Anthony, anytime.
Oh, I may take you up on that now. What are you doing next week? So, of course, you and IBM are one of the leading voices in AI, and it seemed like last year everybody was talking about what's going on with Gen AI in particular. And this year, maybe because of political issues or other world economic issues going on, it's kind of moved off the side, but it's clearly still driving discussions and work every day. Where do you think we are in this journey?
So I think what has happened, and I think Gartner talks about it this way, is that we were in the hype cycle last year. Everybody running around trying to experiment. I think what is happening now is it's not that companies are backing off. If anything, I think they're doubling down, but they're being more intentional. Last year was a little bit about see what sticks, try everything. Now it's saying, okay, we saw some things fail. We saw other companies do things that seem to work well. Let's narrow down our focus and see where we can really get value. So we're out of the experimentation phase and we're now into what I'll call practical, intentional use cases. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of really interesting work being done for the HR profession, not only how it's transforming our own profession, but how HR professionals are also helping their companies transform different job roles.
And even a year ago, you were giving extraordinary examples about how it was really helping IBM not just be more efficient, but also more effective in delivering higher end quality to people. Do you have more examples or more things you'd say you've learned about it?
We do. Yeah. So, last year we started some additional pilots. We've been on this journey with what we called Ask HR, our digital assistant chatbot. And originally the vision of that was just questions and answers. And then we put in transactions. How can it actually do work for people? How can it transfer employees? How could you type in that you needed to change your address and let the assistant do the work for you? And so that was pretty exciting. But then generative AI came along, because remember, a lot of what companies were doing prior to last year was with more traditional AI, where you were training models, you were programming it, it was taking a long time. Generative AI changed the game, and it changed the game in a couple of ways. One, it's a lot faster. With generative AI and the large language models, it's less about training and it's more about taking models that exist and tuning it. The second thing that it changed the game about is generative AI has memory, whereas traditional AI didn't. It viewed every question as a one-off transaction. Well, now you can have much more robust discussions in generative AI. You can ask benefits questions and first order, second order, third order questions off of that first one, and the generative AI is tracking with you in that conversation. But the thing it also introduced was the famous concept of hallucination. What happens when it goes rogue, when it's being creative, when it's giving you an answer that isn't exactly right? So we did a lot of experimentation last year with our traditional Ask HR assistant and said, if we moved it to generative AI, what would change? And we did 2 pilots. One was in career and skills, and one was in benefits. Career and skills was wildly successful because most companies like ours, a career path is really choose your own adventure. And so employees are always wanting to know, what job should I take next? What training should I take next? And the reality is, no two people take the same path. And so having a generative AI and natural language, which is able to kind of riff and follow a conversation and give you different possibilities, was really, really valuable to our employees. On the benefits side, though, I would say it was not as successful, because benefits is an area where there's an answer to every question. It's very clear what the terms and conditions are, what the policies are. And so creativity isn't necessarily something you want to see as much. So with that pilot, we kind of evolved our thinking. We are going to move Ask HR to a generative AI assistant on January 1, with one little asterisk. There's going to be a set of content, largely benefit questions, that are going to be traditional AI. It's going to have guardrails on it to make sure that it's giving accurate answers every time. But you're still going to get the benefit for most of the content of the memory, of the natural language that is really what is the essence of generative AI.
So those are really fascinating, both of those. So two parts to this one.
Yeah.
First, what does it do when you allow all of these things to now be done electronically?
Yeah.
What does that do for all the employees that are still there? Not just from the benefit side, but more about how can they spend their time?
Yeah, so when you think about, well, what's the value? So let's talk about the broad IBM population. It does a couple things. If you're spending, let's say you're a seller or a developer, if you're spending less time trying to navigate an HR policy or process, if you're getting real-time answers, there's tremendous value. You can spend more time coding. You can spend more time with a client. You can spend more time building product. That's a huge benefit to the broader organization. Second, it's also a retention tool. If you think about the career and skills discussion that I had, if the ability to access what is essentially a career coach, a career assistant, rather than thinking about, well, do I have to leave IBM to pursue this next opportunity? Does it exist internally? How do I prepare myself for it? You're now putting that career coach at the fingertips of every single IBMer, which is a huge retention and engagement play. If you think about HR, so in the past, you would have had many of these HR professionals answering these questions, whether it was benefits questions or general policy process questions. What that has allowed us to do is it has allowed us to reallocate that time to higher order things. People often ask me, but what? For IBM, it's meant a couple things. Workforce planning. So working with business leaders, location leaders to think about ins and outs, because workforce planning, while it's strategically important to every company, when you get pulled into all of the transactional day-to-day questions, you don't have time for it. A second piece is around leadership coaching. So rather than if I were your HR generalist, your HR business partner, rather than me spending all the time talking to you about, Anthony, here's how you get the link to the compensation planner. Anthony, don't forget this policy. You've got to go in and improve this. That's all being prompted by generative AI. You and I might spend the 30 minutes we have together today instead talking about how do you show up for a leadership meeting that you're about to have? How do you have a difficult performance conversation? And again, what this is doing is it's taking that transactional work and we're filling it with higher value things that is allowing the organization to deliver on its business results.
And now I know you've been talking about this stuff for a long time, and it seems like IBM is really open with all employees about where AI or Gen AI is or is not being used. Is that important? Do employees need to know where this stuff is engaging or not engaging?
Yeah, and I'll maybe even go broader than this. Transparency is really important on AI. But I would say this is a big shift that is happening in organizations in general, in society in general, and expectations of your workforce. Transparency is now a value, I think, of employees, of workers in any industry, in any country. And so, yes, it applies to AI. And so we feel very strongly about telling our employees when AI is working, how it's working, what data it's using. But it's not just in AI. I think that this is now a leadership quality. And if we think about executive succession, I think testing leaders' ability to deal with transparency and communicate openly is going to be a new critical success factor.
We hear a lot of people talking about like transparency with compensation, for instance. And you're saying it is also true with AI, but it's not different. It's the same everywhere.
Absolutely.
What do you, separating away from AI, or maybe it's related to or not, but what do you see as some of the biggest people challenges that organizations are going to face in the next few years?
So one of them is exactly what I just spoke about, which is transparency. This idea of black box, or because corporate said, or because a leader decided, a what without the why doesn't work anymore. And so I think that is something that leaders are going to have to pivot to. I think organizations are going to have to pivot to. And they'll have to pivot to it for two reasons. One, you're going to need to have leaders that are more comfortable explaining the why, that maybe grew up in a system where the why didn't matter, compliance mattered. And so this idea of leaders that are comfortable and understand that they have to give the why. But two, in your decision-making processes, the why has to be part of it. Are we willing to be transparent about why we're making this decision? If the answer is no, you probably need to look for another decision. And so that is a totally different dynamic, both in the communication, but even in the decision-making that has to happen before that. So I think that is one, again, that is industry agnostic, that is country agnostic. I think that's facing all organizations.
And how do you help leaders appreciate that, who may have grown up in a system that they were a little more direct about what they want, and they expect people to just do what they say?
And I think it's this idea, we talk at IBM about one of our leadership attributes is followership. And we talk about followership being more important than leadership. Leadership is about the individual. Followership is more about the organization. And we need individuals, we need leaders that are focused on followership. And here's the way I often think about it. If you just focus on the because I said so, or here's the decision, it's good for one time. If you can explain the decision, you now have a group of people that are bought into it, that as the organization gets a little more dynamic, or there's a tweak on something they're experiencing, they'll say, wait a minute, but I understand the rationale by the decision. And in the spirit of that rationale, here's a judgment I can make because I understand the why, not just the very specific what. And so I think if you can talk to leaders about, well, this can be scary, but if you think you can talk to leaders about this is actually setting you up for future success in a different way, not only because you have individuals that feel respected and valued because they're part of it, but also because it will allow them to make the next decision and the next decision because they understand the fundamental rationale.
So it sounds like this is a key to helping decentralize to some extent, which then empowers everyone to make the organization that much more effective?
Absolutely. And when you think about this, yes, empowerment is a good thing. That, again, I think leads to engagement and retention. But particularly in the business environments we are living in now that are moving faster than we ever thought they did, and some of it's due to AI and that technology, but also where it's much more nuanced and every situation somebody's dealing with. I think it allows that effectiveness to happen in a really unique way.
Right. So you talk about these are kind of skills that you want your leaders to have. Thinking about the skills of our new graduates, and you just spoke to our students, so
yes.
Thank you. What are some of those skills that you really would like new HR professionals to be thinking about?
Yeah, so I will start with one thing. I know in this age of AI, there's a lot written out about, is domain expertise still important or not? Won't AI just answer all of the domain questions? And my perspective on that is no. In fact, if anything, I think domain expertise becomes more important for two reasons. One, AI is going to maybe answer that foundational level, but there are going to be then more higher order domain specific questions that need to be answered. And that's where humans, the domain experts, really come into play. The second reason why I think domain experts are important is this concept of hallucination that we talked about. You have to have expertise to know in those cases where the AI is wrong, you know it's wrong. And then how do you adjust from that? So to me, domain expertise for our workforce, whether they are entry-level hires coming in from the university or even experienced professional hires, I think is very critical. And then when I think about the other skills that are important, this is going to be, a build on things like communication and collaboration. That all exists. But there's a new dynamic happening, and it's because of the rate and pace of the way work is changing and how companies are having to be more adaptive. And that is, you bring this domain expertise, and you have to be courageous enough to come up with ideas, new ways of working things. If the current process isn't working, regardless of your level in the organization, are you bold enough? Are you courageous enough to bring that forward? And then the question is, are you resilient enough? Do you have enough grit that if you try something new and it doesn't work, that it doesn't dissuade you from bringing another bold idea again? And so this idea of courage and then grit or resilience of through failure, I think is really important.
So how do we help our managers help embolden people to have that courage? Because it doesn't take many times that we get screamed at for having made a mistake that even the most bold of us will be more reluctant to keep engaging.
Exactly. And so I think you got on one really critical point on this is failure isn't failure. Failure is expected. And so this idea of if you're being bold, if you're trying something new, you're going to fail more often than you succeed. And so this idea of managers, rather than kind of going into this failed, what are the consequences, what are the repercussions, what did you learn from it? What should we do next are some of the questions that managers now need to ask instead. I also think you've got to, as managers now, seek those bold ideas, because most of our organizations aren't wired this way, especially if we've been around for a while. And so people are used to following a process, understanding the protocol. And so as a manager, I think it's really important to have these discussions around, let's stop for 5 minutes in this meeting. Okay, we all have a plan of attack, but if we were going to do something really unusual, really first of a kind, pretend money's no object, time's no object, what would you do? I think more of those sessions where managers are soliciting the bold ideas, once you do that as a fairly regular practice, it then just becomes part of the ways of working in a team.
And as part of this development, from kind of going back to throughout a career, you took your family to China a couple of times.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about how those experiences helped develop you as an HR professional and then even now in your role as CHRO?
Yeah. So, and again, because I do believe that most careers are a choose your own adventure, I think many people get caught up sometimes in their career pathing, particularly if they're ambitious, to think about what's the next logical step. I would argue that maybe sometimes taking the illogical step is the one that's going to give you kind of the biggest growth, the biggest opportunity. I always say, pick your next job, not because of the manager, not because you love the content, but is it going to teach you something new? When we went to China the first time, I was only a couple years in the company, and there would have been other logical steps for me, especially with a relatively new husband and a new baby. But this idea of the fact that the geography would challenge me, the business model was different, and the talent model was different was something that became very exciting. And so I think in your career, you need to think about those skills.
Do you think in this day and age where working remote is so easy and so common now that those kind of like international experiences or movement for people is still valuable?
I do think it's valuable. It's different, kind of experiencing different cultures via Zoom or, video conference than it is actually immersing yourself in day-to-day life. So again, I am all for global teams, and I think people should get as many of those experiences as possible, even if they're virtual, because you will learn something. But there's a whole other level of learning when you are immersed in a location and really seeing the day-to-day interactions.
And then switching again, and my last question for you, and then I'll let you get out of here. What is the CHRO's role with the board of directors?
So, every CHRO you ask is going to give you a slightly different answer to this, probably because boards and companies have different expectations. But I see it at a very, fundamental level is, yes, all CHROs need to manage the governance of the board when it comes to compensation and other things in particularly your management resources, your talent, your compensation committee charter. But that's just table stakes. So yes, the CHRO is very deeply involved in those governance items. But I also see two other really critical roles. And I think CHROs that are most effective with their board kind of elevate to these two levels. The first is that they are the talent strategy expert. So just like you might think of the CFO as the financial expert in the room, just as you may think about the head of sales who comes into the board meetings really being about the go-to-market, the channel, the revenue, it is really important that the CHRO with the board takes that mindset of the talent expert, setting the strategy, setting the operation execution plan, because for most of our companies, talent is the single biggest investment our company makes. And so thinking about your job that strategically and not just the governance is really important. And then the last thing that I think is critical is you are a member of the management team, but you are also an independent steward of the leadership team. And so there is an element of the CHRO that sometimes in some organization needs to make sure that they have that direct access to the board, giving their independent evaluation of how the leadership team is doing, where there are gaps, and then helping to close those gaps. And so I kind of think those are the three roles we play.
How about CEO succession?
Well,
have to talk about that.
You have to talk about CEO succession. And look, in my perspective, it squarely falls into all three of those categories. So if you think about this, when you're thinking about governance, are you building robust enough succession plans? Do you have an emergency succession plan that is reevaluated on a continual basis? Table stakes, governance. If you think about talent strategy then, I think it is the CHRO's job to think about the different avenues where you might get candidates from, how you might develop candidates. Of course, the CEO will have a point of view. But as the expert and kind of the broad aperture of everything that's out there, you need to make sure that they're thinking about all of those pieces on a talent strategy basis. And then on the independent kind of steward of the leadership team, you also should have your own point of view about the succession process. Oftentimes the CEO and the CHRO are completely aligned, but you have a responsibility when you're not to voice that.
As always, thank you for coming here. The students, of course, love having you here. We all love having you down here. So thank you very much.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Anthony.
You just listened to another CHRO Conversation. Today, I spoke with Nicole Lamoureux of IBM. She shared her views regarding the need for trust and transparency when it comes to ethical AI. She also shared some thoughts on when to implement AI versus Gen AI to support appropriate HR programs. Nicole also highlighted the skills that are needed today for HR professionals and the ones that are critical for the future of work. On behalf of all of us who are associated with the Master of Human Resources program and the Center for Executive Succession here at the University of South Carolina, thank you for joining us.